Kaixo berriz ere. Bien, ya tenemos el chute de cafeína necesario.
So we've all taken the necessary coffee to be able to close this meeting in the best way possible. We've talked about the digital sphere and male chauvinist violence. The expert Molinier has talked about this. And we've talked about assault and violences that affect women all over the world from all ages. We've heard about grooming, sexual abuse online, and so on and so forth. The violence that was happening offline now is going to another dimension online and has the capacity of spreading out in the fastest way possible and with anonymity. So this is one of the main things against human rights, and that's why it's also part of the agenda on gender equality. It's another way of control that is done in a public manner, because it's also the way of saying to women that this public sphere, this public arena doesn't belong to us. It's a way of, in a collective manner, teaching us a lesson to tell us this is not our space. What else I can say about this? The good thing is that the technological and scientific sphere can do so much to try and minimize this and fight it in a more constructive manner, in which men are not only perpetrators but should also be and are agents of change. So let's go on to the next round table on violence against women in the digital world, and we have as moderator Cristina Garcia, head of the Innovation Observatory of Navarre. Round of applause for her. Thank you, Maitena. First of all, I would like to thank Emakunde, the Basque Women's Institute, for their invitation. This is a wonderful session. We've had wonderful speakers, and with your introduction, I don't need to add more to this. But before giving the floor to the experts that will be joining me, I would like to provide a concept framework with UN Women, because it details that digital violence is the one that happens and is spread out through social media, email, and other apps, and that damages dignity, integrity, and the safety of women and girls. And there's two things I want to mention. 7 of 10 women in the world have suffered digital violence, and the women from 18 to 30 is when women are more attacked online. So now I would like to give the floor to Emma Short, and I will briefly introduce her. Emma Short is psychologist of the London Metropolitan University and co-founder of the National Centre on Research on Cyber Assault. She's carried out different research projects on this sphere, so we give her the floor.
Right. Okay. Well, first, I want to say thank you for the invitation. I've been made to feel so welcome. I think everyone has. The organisers have been extraordinarily kind of facilitative. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I've had a lot of wonderful conversations with people that I'd like to continue. You can find me at the London Metropolitan University or on LinkedIn, but don't be confused by the photograph. Like most academics, I haven't updated it since 2012. So yeah, I'm there, but I might not look the same. Okay, so we are going to start by, first of all, thinking we've had so many great strategies presented to us for prevention and for evening out opportunities to achieve gender equality. But I'm going to throw a bit of a dampener on and talk about what are we going to do now, because we need to respond to existing victimization and offer immediate support to the women who are experiencing it right now. So I'm going to give a brief and simple, very simplistic outline of the landscape of online violence against women and come up with some suggestions at the end. So there's one definition here by the Centenary Action Group about what online violence is for women, and it basically names the technological advanced types of attack. It's looking at things like intimate image abuse, unsolicited explicit pictures. It's looking at deepfake pornography. So it's sort of gone for the headlines and the really techie types of abuse, which are evident, but really we need to add to that the huge amount of general hate that's not designed by genius. It's people talking to each other online. And it's based on protected characteristics and biological sex. Also, add to that the more serious digital violence that has fuzzy boundaries. So it has its roots in crimes and violence that have historically disproportionately affected women and whose perpetrators are now weaponizing the online space. And I'm talking about forms of violence and crime like coercive control, domestic abuse, and stalking. And in these crimes, platforms are used to escalate levels of surveillance, control, intimidation, and reputation damage. So the scale and the penetration of what were traditionally a course of conduct crime that affected people, it's blown up. It's so much bigger than it ever was in terms of the damage that can be done to individuals by someone who's fixated upon them or refusing to release them. We've got a bit of a problem with the data. I don't know much about data or big data. All I've done is read reports, and it's clear that we're not absolutely certain how fast this is growing globally, and if it's increasing everywhere at the same rate, because we need to consider what policies and social norms are influencing the growth of this sort of crime. The European Institute for Equality suggests it's a difficult question to answer. Is it growing, and where is it growing, and why? They talk about low comparability of data across member states. They talk about the invisibility of women and girls in terms of online violence. And we know our prevention, our strategies, our policies can only ever be as good as the data. And we know the data can be patchy. So this is one of the big calls, that we need to get consistent and collect meaningful data. I also want to raise the idea of the fact that if we want to understand the actual rates of abuse as policymakers, as educational institutions, we need to engage and understand the positive role of third sector agencies, which have been supporting communities and victims of online violence. And we'd be very wise to form stronger alliances with them. We know from research that I've been involved in, for example, during the pandemic, that they're often found to be the most trusted organizations by women, especially women who are being victimized. And as a consequence, they often have the most accurate figures because these crimes are so very often underreported. This was really demonstrated during lockdown and the pandemic. The police figures of crime reports for things like hate crime based on protected characteristics and stalking and domestic abuse were very slow to rise. But at the same time, the DA and stalking services were reporting being overwhelmed by demand and an increase in calls. In fact, one of our biggest domestic abuse charities, Refuge, talked about a 120% increase in the first 6 months of lockdown. And technological abuse featured very highly in all of those reports. So the problem with online violence, we know it's happening, we know it's difficult to deal with. So I just want to talk a little bit about the background of it and why it's difficult to deal with. Online crimes are complex. They often involve repeated targeted behaviours by offenders against selected victims. This is not something case law deals with well. The anonymity provided by online spaces makes it even more challenging, with often the burden on the victim to have to identify the person in order to be able to report it to someone who can help. It's often very difficult as well to understand the impact of hate and violence based on characteristics because it's connected with the personal identity and history of women. This means that the impact of what might seem a trivial incident or just a one-off to anyone watching it or a bystander If they don't share those personal characteristics, they fail to see the impact and they fail to see the meaning. Similarly, we must recognize that online hate has a wider impact on families, peers, and communities of the victims, particularly when they share the same characteristics. Hate and abuse silences sections of the community, giving the louder voices control of the narrative. And we see this over and over again in different aspects of our lives. Overall, online violence against women and girls cannot be understood without understanding the overall context, including the social history of the targeted group, the personal history of the individual victim, and therefore we must consider the deeply rooted gender inequality central to online violence against women and girls. I want to talk about the disproportionality of online abuse and violence. Briefly, it's more complex than it seems, like everything is in this realm. If we look at Amnesty's report from 2017, 2018, they found that 1 in 5 women suffered online abuse or harassment, and 50% said the abuse was sexist or misogynistic, gender-based violence. But let's contextualize it and look at how it compares with that of men, because often I think these statistics are quoted and we lose power if we don't contextualize them and put them against the experience that men have. So the Pew Institute, which is a largely American-based research company, found that age and gender are indeed most closely associated with online harassment, with young women, again, as you made the point earlier, Christina, being the most likely to experience it. So if you're aged under 30 and you're female, you will get by far the most abuse. This study also reported that 47% of women online who were harassed thought it was on grounds of their gender, but that compared with 18% of men. So 18% of men who were harassed felt it was because they were male, whereas 47% of women were harassed because they felt it was because they were a woman. Men and women also appear to experience different types of abuse. Men are more likely to experience, at the serious end, homophobic and racist abuse, and women are more likely to experience stalking and sexual harassment. In my own work, I've found that in populations who've been cyber-stalked, generally women are by far the highest group, 80 to 90% at minimum. And in the most recent study, the people who'd been stalked through multiple means, so that's on and offline, 78% of them screened positively for a measure of post-traumatic stress disorder and should have been referred on for further support. That's lasting and life-changing damage. That's not just stress and distress. And also, before I move on, if I unpack a bit, when I talk about stalking, the gendered characteristics of male and female victims of stalking are very different. The perpetrators and the motivations who pursue women tend to be very different from the ones who pursue men. And the likelihood of violence against women or even homicide is far greater. Reputation damage is often something that's very much associated with being a male victim of stalking. But there are papers and papers on that, so I won't go any further on that. Okay, so having said all of that, interestingly, if you looked at that US study, more men reported being abused online than women, and that was one of the top lines. But if we've unpacked it, more serious crimes seem to affect women. Things like, there was an example here, 35% of men say they've experienced offensive name-calling, for example, and that comes under abuse, that comes on online violence or hate, with far fewer women experiencing that. But 16% of women compared to 5% of men were sexually harassed. 13% of women compared to 9% of men were stalked. So the more serious crimes seem to be attached to women, whilst the engagement of abusive conversations, often men were often sort of scoring more highly. And that's quite interesting, especially having heard this morning about the predominance of men online and inhabiting that space. So perhaps it's a volume thing. But this is why we're all in the same room, to try and understand some of these things and unpack them. The impact of violence online is different for men and for women. And some of that is about populations who've endured hate. It's a cumulative effect. Populations who receive more hate tend to experience hate more acutely. And it's certainly the case in men and women when you look at some of the published work about it. A report, say, from Amnesty International talks about 55% of women who've experienced offline consequences, including anxiety, stress, or panic attacks, and things like loss of self-esteem and powerlessness in their ability to respond to abuse. And if men and women were asked by the Pew Institute if they found the online abuse very distressing, 34% of women said yes, but 14% of men said yes. So again, you've got a big variation there. Intersectionality, I'm so glad this has come up again and again. I've really learned a lot about it and my understanding of intersectionality over the course of this Congress. I just want to mention that it's very, very important to look at this in terms of online hate specifically. A study looking specifically at at Twitter by Amnesty International looked at women who receive abuse. Just quickly, let's put it in perspective because the figures talk for themselves. Women of colour were more likely to be mentioned in abusive tweets, 34% more likely to be mentioned in abusive tweets than white women. Okay, so we're looking at women as a whole. But if you look at black women specifically, they were 84% more likely to be receiving or attached or mentioned to abusive or problematic tweets. And a good example of this is a black Labour politician called Diane Abbott. During the year of study, about 3% of the tweets directed at her were highly abusive, included rape threats, death threats, and racial slurs. 3% doesn't sound much, but that was 30,000 tweets that her staff had to go through in order to identify whether or not they posed a significant risk to her safety. So the time spent on security, especially for women of colour who are public-facing or politicians, is enormous. Okay, so to wrap up, I think it's really important that violence against women and girls in all its forms needs to be a priority harm, and that's in policing. Okay, we've talked about it in terms of policy and in terms of incentives to receive funding, but perhaps the policing and deterrence also need to be brought in, so the stick and the carrot. In the UK, in July 2023, violence against women in all its forms was made a priority harm, and that included online and tech-enabled violence. And what they're doing there is putting it as a national priority alongside terrorism and serious organised crime, because if you look at the death rate for abuse against women, you know, it's comparable, if not greater. Identifying offences like this as a priority set clear expectations. They set clear expectations for how local and regional police capabilities will tackle it. They also apply expectations to how local police forces or law enforcement agencies might engage with other agencies, like those trusted agencies I've been talking about. And it also highlights the general challenge for all organisations in terms of skills and knowledge gap, because we do have knowledge gaps. We also need to consider the impact of abuse on the individual and society. While protecting the freedom of expression, we must also offer protection against hate speech, such as misogyny, and recognise the validity of the acute psychological harm caused by each incident, as well as the chronic harms caused by an unequal environment and the consequences of persistently uneven free expression, which leads to the silencing or self-censoring of women and minorities. We need to have consistent and meaningful collection of data, and obviously technology, law and education have key roles to play, and people here have talked about design requirements and design team requirements in order to make a more diverse, more representative digital environment for us. But before I sign off, I'm going to make one more call. We need, within our organisations, to respond to the immediate harm that some women are experiencing now. We need better support services within our institutions, and I would strongly suggest that working with partners from national or regional services who have supported women who've experienced gender-based violence for decades would give us some of the best expertise. And if our institutions want to develop effective interventions, both in terms of preventative programs and support for women who are experiencing these things, we need our services to be informed by them. That's all.
Muchas gracias, Emma. Y ahora vamos a dar paso a...
Thanks very much, Emma. And now we're going to give the floor to the next speaker, Alan Greig. Alan Greig is an expert in gender issues with more than 20 years of experience under his belt in topics related to masculinity, violence, and oppression in the global South and North. He has founded a project on the supremacy of male based in New York, and he's committed to social justice where gender equality plays a central role. When you have the floor, sir.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you to Emma Kunde for this invitation to participate in the conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm just getting over COVID, which I got late last week. So yeah, I'm going to share some thinking around networked misogyny and this what's called the Manosphere, and share some thinking about what that is, why it's happening now, and what we might be able to do about it. And in response to the data that Emma just laid out so clearly, there's clearly a huge problem around men's violence against women online that we need to get to grips with. So I'm going to try and go through 4 questions. What is the Manosphere? Why is it flourishing now? How is it working in terms of how is it engaging men in its hate speech and misogynistic politics, and what can be done by men about it? So the Manosphere is a term that's been applied to a kind of online ecosystem of misogynist movements focused on men's issues, which has prospered online. And a lot of those issues kind of are related to sex and sexuality. So it's important to think about those aspects of sex and sexuality as we think through the misogyny that's going on. There are a range of groups that fall under this umbrella of the Manosphere. They're not always aligned on all issues, sometimes conflicting. But they share a common worldview around misogyny and anti-feminism. Some of the groups and online sites that get the most research attention are men's rights groups, which often around fathers' rights, for example, pickup artists, which are kind of sites and guides around seduction and heterosexual success for men. In contrast to that, MGTOW, men go their own way, discussion forums for men who want to reject contact with women. Incels, you've probably heard of, involuntary celibates. These are groups of men who feel they've been denied their right for sexual access to women, so they're involuntarily celibate. And the red pill is a reference to the Matrix movie. You take the red pill to have the truth of the world revealed to you. And the truth for the Manosphere is that it is men who are oppressed, not women. So those are some of the common sites that get the most research attention. And some of the research suggests that you can see this evolution of well, I'm not sure if you can see it too well, but there's an evolution in terms of these different groups and the number of posts that are reflected in each of them. And we see a kind of increase in incel and MGTOW activity and a slight decrease in men's rights and pickup artists. And this has been understood as a kind of progress from progress towards more radical and extreme views. Newer communities are significantly more toxic. And as US academic Jack Bratich notes, the Manosphere names a part that seeks to turn all of the internet into itself. So it's a man-spreading project. It seeks to infuse the totality of the digital sphere with a technologically facilitated war on women. So it's very clearly understood as not just, we need to understand the Manosphere broadly as not just this discrete number of particular sites and channels, but a kind of broader effort. And he goes on, Jack Bratich, an expanded terrain of the long-standing war on women, the manosphere refers not merely to a part of the internet or tendency to become the whole of the internet, but as an operation to expand the war on women everywhere. So it kind of reflects the generalizing tendency of the manosphere to expand. So how do we understand this? Well, it's clear that it's not come from nowhere. That it has its roots in long histories of anti-feminism. You can trace some aspects of the manosphere back to men's rights activism and movements of the 1970s. And clearly it's bound up in the US, at least, with developments in white evangelicalism, the right, the more extreme turn of the Republican Party, and so on. I think it's important to note there's a heterogeneous politics going on. So you have a conservative politics of kind of patriarchal families and patriarchal authority, all the way through to a kind of neoliberal politics of marketing of the self. A grifter like Andrew Tate is all about self-promotion and wealth creation through misogyny, to a kind of libertarian anti-woke politics. It's also resonating with different political actors and forces. So manosphere themes and memes show up in the politics of Trump, Orban, Putin, Modi in different ways. Regime critics in Iran and China have been targeted by manosphere themes and memes. And certainly you will have been familiar in Spain with the Rubiales incident, and the Spanish manosphere got very active around that. So different political actors are linking with this online ecosystem of anti-feminist groups. We've talked about the radical extremist trajectories. And also, I think, as Emma was saying, we need to recognize that there are fuzzy boundaries between the online and offline worlds. And certainly we are living online, offline, always, right? And certainly if you look at groups like incels, some of the most extraordinary acts of mass killings have been perpetrated by self-declared incels in different incidents in the US, at least. So why now? Why is this happening now in particular? I think there's something to do with digital technologies themselves. The scale and the speed have allowed for this spread of misogynistic hate speech and violence that Emma was describing. It's facilitated, as Emma was saying, by anonymity online, and also permission, right? There's certain sites lack any kind of content moderation. So there's a kind of permission to extremist hate speech. Some research suggests that growing numbers of men are receptive to manosphere themes because of a crisis of masculinity, for a variety of reasons linked to do with social and economic changes. Men are experiencing kind of psychosocial anxieties that leave them open to some of the messaging around the anti-feminist messaging from the manosphere. I think it's important, we need to talk about that. There are definitely things going on in different men's lives in different societies around substance use, mental health issues, suicide rates that are real. So we need to think about that in relation to what's going on in the manosphere. On the other hand, this notion of a crisis of masculinity has been invoked regularly throughout history in different societies to explain different social and economic transitions. So I'm not sure it's unique to this particular context. I think what is different about this context is that whatever is going on for men is being monetized by actors in the manosphere. So the business models of social media platforms, the attention economy, feeds off hate speech. Twitter has built its business around allowing and even inciting, algorithmically inciting outrage and anger and grievance. And certainly that monetizing of those emotions has been a part of the growth of the manosphere. So we see, I think, in the manosphere an example of this new political form of publics forming around particular issues and particularly around particular feelings. So affective publics, and they are intensified. They're kind of volatile publics that form around a feeling, and they're intensified through a kind of digital circulation of hate speech and misogynistic texts and images, which intensify this feeling of a movement building around a particular grievance. So it's a new kind of movement, this circulation of digital hate speech. And Paparachisi refers to this. I mean, the language is a little academic, but media platforms are inviting an effective attunement, an effective alignment with particular emotions of anger or grievance or outrage, and then inciting an investment in these emotions. So we need to reckon with the ways in which these grievances are being mobilized. Now, clearly part of the grievance that's being mobilized is an anger about feminist progress. So some of the politics of the manosphere is about returning to a pre-feminist stage, restoring a lost patriarchal authority. So there is a patriarchal backlash going on that's about the progress that has been made by women in a feminist politics. But it's also complicated because I think some aspects of the politics you see on the manosphere expresses itself in terms of a post-feminist politics. So the idea that feminism has achieved its goals and that feminists complaining about gender oppression are now punishing men unnecessarily. So we even have the phenomenon of women online supporting anti-feminism and aligning themselves with this notion of men's victimization by feminists. So there's a hashtag Team Alienadas in Spain itself, which is women posting anti-feminist messaging online in support of this notion of men's victimization. So the anger around this feminist success, the patriarchal backlash, I think we all should also contextualize in terms of right now, in terms of this idea that we're living through a polycrisis of linked social, economic, ecological crises. There's a good deal of anger and confusion and resentment going around, and people are looking for answers. And the manosphere provides some answers to men in terms of what to do about that crisis. Some of that is couched in terms of a nihilism, right? So there's a kind of nihilistic politics of some parts of the manosphere. You know, the red pill that I talked about earlier is now talked about in terms of a black pill. So we see the truth of the world around us, which is men's oppression, but there's nothing we can do about it. That's the black pill, that's the nihilism. On the other hand, there's other parts of the manosphere which kind of frame themselves in terms of male self-improvement, that men need to recover a sense of themselves as men to deal with all the crises that are going on in their lives. So it's kind of Jordan Peterson and grifters like that online. Jordan Peterson wrote this book called 12 Rules for Life, targeting men. It's a kind of self-help guide for men, but framed in a kind of anti-feminist, misogynistic worldview. And clearly the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, which we're seeing in the last few years in different parts of the world, which is linked to this kind of polycrisis, I think. And there's a kind of racialized authoritarianism, which has always been misogynistic. If you go back to, the fascism of the 30s and even further back, there was always that kind of racialized authoritarianism was always misogynistic as well. So a misogynistic politics has flourished in conjunction with a flourishing or a resurgence of racialized authoritarianism. And this picture on the right is a reference to the infamous the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville in 2017. And if you looked at images from that protest, it was overwhelmingly men at the protest. So as I say, it works through this notion of the red pill. It claims to reveal the truth of men's victimization. So there's a kind of revelation. It reveals the truth. And, you know, we can see this is feeding in or resonating with a kind of conspiracy politics that particularly flourished during COVID, but predated COVID. You know, the QAnon phenomenon in the US, the idea that we are being duped by elites and we need to reveal the truth to ourselves. Well, the Manosphere version of that is that men are being duped into believing that women are victims, and it's actually men are the real victims. It's also framed in terms of the natural order of men's authority and domination is being disrupted and disturbed by feminism and gender ideology. So there's a need to kind of restore a natural order of men's rule. So this renewed appeal to nature, biologism, and also a natural order between men. I think this is important to note, and Emma talked about intersectionality. So the Manosphere is also about hierarchies amongst men as well as men over women. And those hierarchies are to do with lots of things, gender and sexual expression and sexual identity, but also crucially racial identity as well. There's a politics of polarization and a positing of us versus them, and this notion of mobilization. So men needing to recover their virility to deal with the struggles which they are facing. We talked about some of those mental health issues. So there are struggles that we need to think about in terms of going on, not just in women's lives, but in different men's lives as well. But clearly the Manosphere is monetizing and weaponizing them for its political and economic purposes. And the mobilization crucially is around this kind of vigilante policing. So the violence, a lot of the violence that Emma talked about, I think we can understand it in terms of a vigilante policing of women's bodies, women's participation in public spaces and public speech and political life, and also a vigilante policing of these male-on-male hierarchies. One of the more difficult things to reckon with, I think, is the kind of subversive politics of the Manosphere. It appropriates a lot of progressive ideas around rights. You know, the men's rights discourse, appropriates a language of rights, the language of victimhood or vulnerability. The Manosphere appropriates that language. It's very digitally savvy. Its heavy use of memes and visual media is very well suited to digital contexts. And its use of a kind of vicious humor, the trolling, the lots of laughs, the lulls, as a way of disarming critique of its operations. So what can be done? We need to reckon with the politics of what's going on here. Exit sites and strategies. So sites have been created by men who have been a part of these communities. So men who have ended up rejecting the Manosphere ideology have created their own sites to help other men exit, from the rabbit hole. So we need to be supporting those and directing attention towards those. I think we do need to be thinking about mental health. There's a lot of talk about, in the wake of COVID, a crisis of mental health. We do need to be thinking about how we support men in accessing those services. But I think an important aspect of this is not to see that as an excuse for what men are doing online in terms of this online violence. So there's an emphasis in the psychological interventions to learn from kind of domestic violence perpetrator programs, which focus on issues of holding men responsible, pushing them to take responsibility for their actions and gain insight into the harmful effects of their behaviours on others. So we need to invest in services like that. I think crucially there's a need for much more youth-focused work. I know in the UK and the US there have been savage cuts to youth services, and I think that's a disastrous development. We need to be expanding, not cutting youth services, where young people of all genders, and I think particularly cisgendered heterosexual men, can sit down together and talk about what's going on in their lives, how they are relating to their masculinity and what they're learning about patriarchal masculinities and the ways in which they can unlearn that, learning about media and media manipulation, and learning about the effects of men's violence on women and other men and themselves. Crucially, we need to be thinking about institutional change. We need men to be doing much more certainly in their leadership in institutions, to take action to regulate the digital space. We need much more action around content moderation, obviously, and it's men who are in leadership positions who need to be pushing that. We need men in institutions to be more active bystanders. I think one of the, we know that different parts of the tech sector are quite misogynistic in terms of their male peer culture. I think that's well documented. And we need men to be stepping up, to be challenging that male misogynistic peer culture within institutions. And we need men to be allying with women as activists for change, to put pressure for change on institutions. And that includes changing institutions like, Emma mentioned the police, but the police as an institution has lots of problems itself, right? In terms of its misogynistic culture, as the killing of Sarah Everard, Brian Paddock, I think was his name, in the UK, well-documented cases in the UK of misogynistic peer culture within the police itself. So that needs to be addressed. And I think we need to finally reckon with the media, social media itself as a terrain of politics. We need to be fostering progressive, liberatory media that challenges hate speech online and seeing this media as a political struggle. And finally, I'll leave you with a quote from African-American scholar Fred Moten, distinguished professor emeritus, University of California. He was speaking to a white audience, but I think we could see the same in terms of women speaking to men. A coalition to change the situation of gender oppression that we're facing, emerges out of men's recognition that it's fucked up for us. It's fucked up for you as men, in the same way that we, those who are targeted by the oppression, recognize that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help, Fred Moten said. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly. So patriarchal oppression is killing and damaging the lives of women and girls and gender and sexual minorities, and it's killing cisgendered heterosexual men as well, in terms of the male hierarchies and violence that it's creating in everybody's lives. And that's what we need to end and challenge. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Bueno, Alan, fantástica.
Excellent, very insightful presentation. Thanks very much, Alan. Now, at this point, we're going to give the floor to the next speaker, Naiara Bellio, journalist who specializes in privacy and digital rights. And she participates in the German organization Algorithm Watch. And she has led many international research projects on the surveillance and protection of data. You have the floor, madam.
Bueno, hola, buenas. Muchas gracias.
Hello. Thank Thanks very much, Cristina, for kindly introducing me. Thanks, Emakunde, for organizing this event. And thanks, attendees. It's exciting for me to talk with other women about technology. As Cristina has said, I'm a journalist. I specialize in automated decision-making systems. Sometimes these are called algorithms, sometimes not. Sometimes they are AI-empowered, others not. And I believe that it would be interesting to bring to this Congress an algorithm that is used in the Basque Country, because here we're talking about gender violence. We're relating this to the digital sphere. But there are many technologies that help us measure different parameters related with gender violence. Among them, the risk of a victim to be re-attacked, re-assaulted, re-harassed by the author or perpetrator. This is quite common. There is a willingness to analyze risk parameters, and gender violence is a field that has been broadly studied. And AI and the use of algorithms isn't new. These algorithms, some of them have been used for more than 15 years, as I will explain in my presentation. This is an example that I'd like to share with you, which is from the Basque Country. This is an algorithm that is based here. And let me define here. I thought that we would have more foreigners in the room. This algorithm was developed by the local police. The Erchancha is the name we use to refer to the local police. In the Basque Country, the administrations have different law enforcement bodies, local law enforcement bodies, and it's logical that we have a distinct algorithm. Why am I saying this? Well, I'm saying this because in Spain, naturally, we have Biogen, which is a system aimed at predicting the risk of a victim of being re-victimized. But before Biogen, in the Basque Country, EPVR was implemented. It's a similar tool, but it's different in terms of the data that it uses. And as you can see on the last bullet point, research is done through different paths or channels. And in EPV, this is a risk prediction scale of severe violence against the partner. And the algorithm has been built on a platform called EVA, which means Emakunde Etxekoen Baeza, that's Basque. What does this mean? It means protection of women and the household. This is a program used by the local police to assess the level of risk. And as part of this program that they use to track the risk of victims, they apply an algorithm. And together with this, they conduct interviews and do risk assessments. This algorithm is used since 2007 in parallel with Biogen. This means that here in the Basque Country, we use regional Basque data. But in the Basque Country, we also use national Biogen data. This algorithm is used to provide information on the case based on a series of variables. These variables are quite diverse, but not as much as you may think. These are based on nationality, the relationship with the victim, whether there are children involved, if it's an attack against a former partner and there are children involved. Based on what we have been studied, there is often a relationship with the victim. We don't see that many cases of violence against strangers. And there are some studies on the use of the algorithm that are independent from the police use that state that the algorithm in the execution stage, in the operational stage, shows some flaws, some deficiencies, and doesn't show the best performance. For example, in those cases qualified as high risk, it so turns out that more than half of the cases are cases in which the risk of this victim being re-victimized is low. But when those cases are assessed, and analyze in detail, then you see that the risk was high. So the system initially can tell you that the risk of a woman can be severe, medium, or low. Let's imagine that the algorithm says that it's a low risk, but then when you conduct analysis, the risk is high. So the police protection that you're providing the victim based on the algorithm can be perhaps much lower than what it should. And perhaps there are no, policemen providing that surveillance because the assessment of the case is low risk.
Siempre es entregado en el report, en el atestado que hace la policía, siempre se entrega a los jueces. Esto no suele ser común. El resultado que te da un algoritmo sobre una predicción de riesgo es algo que se utiliza a nivel policial, por ejemplo, o en un departamento de prisión, por ejemplo, como se hace en Cataluña, para asesorar diferentes niveles de riesgo. No siempre tiene por qué acabar en un informe judicial. Y, sin embargo, con EPVR pasa. Este es el cuestionario completo de EPVR, es decir, estos son las variables que os decía antes en las que se basa el algoritmo a la hora de hacer su análisis. Aquí lo que se hace es que en el momento en el que la víctima acude a denunciar un caso de violencia de género, los agentes le hacen una entrevista. Le hacen algunas preguntas, pueden ser combinadas con lo que pone en el formulario y van marcando puntitos. En función de lo que vaya respondiendo la víctima, asignan unos puntos o asignan otros. Luego esos puntos se suman y es el resultado que da el algoritmo. Tenemos que a partir de 24 puntos el riesgo es severo, a partir de 18 es alto, a partir de 10 es medio y si es por debajo de 9 es bajo. Aquí vemos algunos de los parámetros, ¿vale? Vamos a ver que muchos tienen que ver con la violencia, esos son los más importantes para los agentes. Como decía, también la relación con la víctima. Tenemos también si la víctima se encuentra en un estado de vulnerabilidad, si por ejemplo tiene dependencia económica de su pareja. Luego hay un punto bastante interesante también, si veis la primera pregunta sobre datos personales, el único que incluyen es si el agresor o la víctima son extranjeros. Aquí hay un tema y es que cuando hablamos de violencia de género relacionada con tecnología, muchas veces nos ocurre que podemos encontrarnos sesgos relacionados con la violencia de género. Hemos estado hablándolo durante todo el congreso en diferentes puntos. Pues, por ejemplo, el lingüístico. Aquí, ¿qué ocurre? Que interseccionan el de género con el de nacionalidad. ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque lo que pasa con este algoritmo en concreto es que los agentes que evalúan este sistema resulta que no consideran que valen como puntos de extranjero a todas las personas que vienen fuera de España. Por lo que sacamos de la investigación que hicimos sobre este algoritmo concreto, resulta que la Ertzaintza en su ámbito de actuación considera que una persona cercana a, digamos, el ámbito europeo o que tiene una concepción europea de lo que es la cultura de pareja, no consideraría al agresor extranjero, pero sí que lo consideraría si se sale de esta burbuja. Aquí podemos asumir que una persona que viene, por ejemplo, de Sudamérica, por no tener una concepción de pareja culturalmente similar a la nuestra, entonces sí que es un extranjero. Pero una persona que vive, por ejemplo, aquí al lado en Francia, no lo es. Aquí vemos un ejemplo muy claro de cómo se relacionan los sesgos relacionados con el género con los riesgos relacionados con la nacionalidad. Y es que en tecnología suele pasar esto, que no influye una sola parámetro o una sola variable. Cuando intentamos aplicar algoritmos para ser un poquito más neutrales y más objetivos, que esto lo vamos a ver ahora, nos damos cuenta que en realidad estamos aplicando nuestros propios prejuicios a la toma de decisiones, a esa cadena que utiliza el algoritmo para tomar decisiones. Este es un ejemplo muy claro que vemos con EPVR. Hay ejemplos también que tenemos con Biogen, pero es que forma parte de los retos que tenemos cuando utilizamos herramientas algorítmicas para asesorar en casos de violencia de género. ¿Por qué? Porque, por ejemplo, a la hora de recoger datos, estos datos pueden estar desfasados, puede ser que ya no sirvan para el estudio que estamos haciendo. Por ejemplo, los datos históricos sí te reflejan patrones. Entonces, normalmente cuando tú diseñas un algoritmo, al final estás aplicando todos esos datos para sacar patrones y en base a lo que te dicen los patrones, tú empiezas a tomar decisiones. ¿Qué pasa? Que para, por ejemplo, aplicar ciertas decisiones algorítmicas ahora en 2023, es muy difícil seguir utilizando datos de 1980, porque al fin y al cabo llevamos 2 días hablando de cómo han ido evolucionando diferentes campos dentro de, por ejemplo, el feminismo y la violencia de género. Es muy difícil que tú sigas actuando sobre cómo eran las cosas en ese momento. Y sin embargo se hace. Luego, por ejemplo, pasa con Biogen que el testimonio de las víctimas que acuden a denunciar en un caso de violencia de género se toma, y esto ha sido sea, sí, se ha sido auditado independientemente, se toma en una situación en el que la víctima se encuentra en un estado de máxima vulnerabilidad.
Ask these questions in a situation of maximum vulnerability of the victim. The victim is reporting before the police and maybe in shock, so maybe their story is affected by this. And of course, there's also an agent there writing down with his or her own words, with his or her perception of what the victim is telling them. So if you want to use an algorithm to start with data that can be subjective, makes things even a bit more complex. So this situation, together with the subjective interpretation, is one of the challenges for algorithms that want to be objective. And also, linked to subjectivity, for example, if you want to assess something that is either black or white, maybe you can use an algorithm that somehow separates into boxes to obtain results. Imagine you need to assess how jealous is someone to know if a victim has a higher or lower risk of being attacked.
Más o menos celosa y encima
how do you show this to a machine? So in this kind of tools, we try and analyze parameters that at a sociological level are complex to measure. However, we are applying this to a machine that supposedly is giving us results that in theory are objective, and this is something that we need to underline. And another challenge that we face with these tools is that sometimes there is a lack of understanding of what is included in the technological field. We sometimes use this technological device to be more efficient, in this case, assessing risk. But who is going to be using this? This is going to be used by agents, but if the agents don't have the adequate training nor understand what they are asking and how these answers are recorded in the app, this system that is going to help them to work in an objective manner, at the end of the day is facing hurdles because they don't know what the technology is for. So this is something that is linked to techno-solutionism and trying to automate everything in theory to make it better. I would also like to underline that when we speak about gender violence, this is one of the reasons why we say that technology is not neutral. This is something that cannot be said anymore, but it is true that depending on what you're speaking, you can reason it in different ways. We're talking about gender violence in the digital field, so we can see how technology is not neutral regarding this specific issue. And there's several reasons for this. One of them has been mentioned throughout this today, and that is who is making the decisions historically regarding this. Everything that has to do with technology development and technology was decided by men. So if men are deciding the kind of technological development you're going to use, it is very difficult for this technology innovation to have a positive impact on women. I was amazed before with a presentation on the lack of scientific research for women's heart attacks, for example. And the same thing happens with commercialization or marketing of that technology. And as Emma explained before, there is directly technology that is directly created to harass women. We have a specific example, that of this boys from Almendralejo that found an app, and they helped to artificially show pictures that were fake of their classmates naked. And if you have a website where you have an app that says you can show whomever you want naked, you see that this is not neutral, but whoever is marketing this has an intention, and that is harassing women. And also we need to take into account something that has been mentioned, and that is that technology reproduces our biases, also that of women. There have been many talks that have underlined the fact that not everything is solved with the presence of women in leader positions, for example, because we also have our own biases and prejudices. So not everything is going to solve because all of the bosses of technology companies are women. There's much more to do to be able to achieve equality in the technology sphere, and that's a challenge too. And of course, the role of the companies that develop that technology is also very significant. And I would like to finish with this specific concept of technology not being neutral applied to this specific case, because this is something that we could continue discussing later on. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Naiara.
Thank you so much, Naiara. Well, I really love the three presentations, and I see that they are interconnected. I want to give space to the speakers on the audience so that you can discuss some of the pending and interesting issues. But I do have one first question. Even though this is the last roundtable for this Congress, I want to go to the beginning and to María Ángeles and her keynote yesterday, because she said something that I really liked. She said, we are always talked about deficit and what still has to be done. So I believe this is very interesting, and linking this to Alan's presentation, I really like that idea of asking men to participate in an active manner, and also going back to the leadership of technology centers and companies, because I believe a lot has to be done regarding this sphere. So I would like to know what's your view from your different viewpoints. Thank you. Yes, you can start. I would like to give an example of a situation I talked in a technology congress a few weeks back. And it was a very technical conference, and we organized an open space with 60 people, and I was moderating, and we were trying to find solutions to concerns in the technology sphere. And for 1 hour, we spoke about our bros from Silicon Valley, and when we started to go into everything that has been mentioned regarding algorithmic biases and how to reduce the gap or the divide, we were also talking about how these algorithms could be better designed, and suddenly we stopped, and surrounded by developers, most of them men. There were not many women in the room, and I said, oh, of course, all these common elements to analyze the design of algorithms to improve. How many of you have really reflected on being moral, ethical, and taking into account the gender perspective before starting to design? And they were all really engaged with the talk, but only 3 people raised their hands, and 2 of them were women, and there were 60 of us in the room. So therefore, I believe we need to go beyond awareness raising, because that's not enough. When we try and explain where the problems are, and we try to explain how we suffer these problems and see how we try to solve them, even there doesn't seem to be a will to change things. So I believe we should go to that next step and not only focus on awareness raising. Thank you.
It's me.
Alan.
No, I agree. We definitely need to move beyond awareness raising. I think we need more leadership. We need to be pushing men in positions of leadership to do more. So there's a kind of pressure from below that needs to happen, and men as activists can be a big part of that. I think the Me Too movement over the past few years has created more of a pressure, but men need to be more active and visible in allying with that. I mean, the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, spoke recently about men needing to step up and do more about toxic masculinity and misogyny. And I think that's one of the few times I've actually heard a male political leader speak publicly, which, you know, is frankly amazing that it's so rare that a male political leader would do that. So, you know, initiatives like the He for She campaign by UN Women, you know, I think the title's a bit problematic in my view, should be He with She. But it's trying to mobilize male leaders to be more visible in speaking out on against men's violence against women and against gender oppression. I think there are issues in terms of how you follow through on the commitments that male leaders make, and you know, there needs to be a better kind of job of holding men to account for the commitments they make to make change. But that would be an example of leadership being shown that we need to build on. Back to you.
De acuerdo.
Thank you. Emma?
Things you could go in with here. I think primarily leadership needs to think about focusing on the behaviours that are the problem. Traditionally, in terms of developments for tech to keep women safe, have placed the burden on the victim. So women change your behaviour, women lock down your accounts, women don't go here, women don't post that. When their behaviours aren't the problem, the problematic behaviours are the aggressive behaviours towards them. So leaderships need to be innovating more, targeting those behaviours. And that, again, that goes back years. Like all of this, it's got its roots in the past. We make women wear different things and not go out at night rather than stop men going out at night if they're more likely to assault them, for example. I also think we need to speak to the bystanders more strongly. And in mainstream, I mean, I really celebrate the film Barbie. I don't know about you. But, you know, let's get that message out there as a generic message. It's a message to everyone. So I think more mainstream discussion that kind of integrates the full gender perspective. More focus on changing behaviours that are problematic rather than restricting women further. Those are the two things that come to mind.
Vale, ¿hay alguna pregunta?
Is there any question from the audience? Any questions?
All right, anyway. Thank you for the interesting talks. I have a question. So you mentioned a lot of voluntary involvement of men and women. What about having legislation help? Like, for example, if you look at Twitter, which some people know as X today, Musk has dissolved, last year, he dissolved the Trust and Safety Board. And he's been consistently firing the moderators of this platform, leaving it open to misinformation and hate speech. Now, what if there would be a legislation that would just oblige any platform to invest a certain amount, a certain percentage of its benefit back into moderating and keeping the platform safe? Instead of asking us, please help us, you have to do it. You have to comply to these safety regulations. That's one question, and it's pretty general. And then I have a second question to Alan about this manosphere. So there are certain hubs in these manospheres, like Andrew Tate, who have a big following and who obviously just spread hate speech and are left doing this and on many platforms. So just by taking out these hubs, could we change or take these dynamics down? Is there anything constructive we can do through moderation, through moderating the speech on a platform? Thank you.
Should I? Well, just on the manosphere, I'm not an expert in tech regulation, and I certainly think we need to be doing all that we can to regulate more firmly misogynistic behaviors and speech online. I think where I'm coming at it from is kind of, we need to also be talking with young men in particular about, you know, what's the appeal of Andrew Tate? Like what's resonating with them about the hate speech that he's spewing out? I got an email from an old college friend who's a teacher in London who wanted, who was kind of confused about how to do an assembly in his school in a very deprived part of London about Andrew Tate, right? Because they were concerned about the appeal of Andrew Tate amongst the boys in the school. So I think we need to be creating spaces as well for young men, well, people, you know, young people in general, but in particular young men, to be talking about and learning about masculinity, what's the appeal of kind of misogynistic masculinity, how do they kind of relate to the way that they're being exploited by people like Andrew Tate, right? He's making money off them. So we need more conversations about that, as well as regulating the hate speech itself.
De acuerdo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Alan.
About tech regulation. Would that be useful? Okay, I can only speak from a UK perspective, but the online safety bill reaches royal assent this week, which is the last point before it becomes law, and it's taken years and years to get there. I have no idea how effective it will be. What happens then is it hands over to a regulatory body called Ofcom, who have to write up and design all the regulations and apply the sanctions or even the fines to companies who don't meet the requirements, like having trust and safety boards. So I would say watch and wait, because who knows if this is going to be effective with tech platforms. But you know, it's a case study in action.
Yo añadí, do you have the, shall I speak in English or español es? Ah, vale, bien, que no sabía si tenías. Aquí hay una cosa también.
There's something else regarding regulation, and I believe it has to improve with the Act on Digital Services, because it is obligatory, as Emma said, to have this kind of teams, but also we need to monitor in a more specific manner everything in platforms. We've talked about disinformation, but also, there's also illegal content that has to do with the safety of young people. And something else that is being discussed in the technology bubble regarding privacy is the issue of chat control. That is a European directive that says that when you distribute content in these platforms, you have to apply a previous filter to what is going to be published to make sure that no child pornography is distributed. So this is a situation, a context in which we don't have privacy, because we are scanning all the contents that are going to be distributed in this social a network that can harm from private devices and so on and so forth. So there is a resistance of those civil society groups before this legislation, because to combat or fight child pornography, you cannot just go against privacy, coding, ciphering, and all the rights that users have. So at the end of the day, we always seem to put too much responsibility on the platforms, and we end up giving them more outer regulation capacity. So they create their own rules, and they are the ones that say how the internet has to be governed, and therefore everything that is published there. So there should be a more efficient regulation, but without giving the platforms the right to decide on what to limit or not, let's say. Well, I don't know if we have time for one last question. One last question from the audience.
barkatu. Egunon. Bueno, yo un poco con lo que...
Good morning. Going back to what Naiara was saying and to leaving everything in the hands of developers, I would like to say that in the Basque Parliament, the initiative of the group EH Bildu talked about the creation of a register of public algorithms. I believe this is one step forward for them to at least be registered, and this registry has to include all algorithms that are used not only in the public administration, that is the Basque government, but also in other local entities like town councils and so on and so forth. So I believe that's stage zero, but at least we know what are the existing algorithms, like the one you just mentioned of the EPV of the Basque police force, and the same for all different departments in the Basque government and so on and so forth. So it's a step forward, but still we don't have an act for artificial intelligence, but this will be the first registry in Spain, and little by little the aim is for AI systems and algorithms to be as more ethical, inclusive, and fair as possible. My question is for the three of you. From public policies and from the public administration, what would you do, or what do you believe should be the trend? What should we be working on to try and avoid problems and for AI to be as ethical, fair, and inclusive as possible? And I know that this is not an easy question.
Pues
the three of you can take the floor. Who wants to take the floor? Okay. As you mentioned me, I will start, if that's okay with you all. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm a journalist. So what I'm working mainly is in providing access to information. And this is usually where I see more problems, specifically for the administration. There is an obstacle to defend, always in the name of defending, for example, the industry, and so on and so forth. So when you go to the administration, you find limitations, and they say, I cannot give you access to this code because this has been developed by a company that is a third party, and I cannot give you information on them, or I cannot give you the data because I want the algorithm to work, but I'm not so interested in who is affected or what is the breakdown by parameters. And if I give you the information, maybe I collect this data, but only for a question in Parliament, but not for whatever you do as a journalist. Or when I ask about databases used, because the systems are based in big databases to exchange data and cross that data with the different parameters. And they say, I cannot give you access to databases because of privacy issues, but I'm not asking for that data at all. So when you ask for information from the administration, not even when you want, because they think you want to attack them, but sometimes you just want to understand what is happening, but they don't know what you're going to do with that information, so they decide not to give it to you, which stops the investigation. Because if you implement an algorithm 15 years ago and society is not aware of this, probably part of the people in government don't know about this. So how is this algorithm useful to your society if you have no information, you don't know how it's implemented, and you get all defensive when you try and access more information? So opening the doors to understanding how these algorithms work is a must-be. And once again, this is my position from my view as a journalist, and I'm sure it's different for others. Well, sorry, and unfortunately, we don't have much time left, so I think I'm going to close the panel here. But before that, I would like to say that as a sociologist, Social sciences are also part of science, and we explain all this that is happening through social science. Thank you.
Very true.